Oh, so we have to move an extension. Okay, moved by Councillor Baker, second by Councillor Dalton. All those in favour? Against? Okay, carried. So we'll bring up the item 11, Auckland Ferry Network update and future procurement. Okay, Gareth and Stacey, over to you to talk us through the ferry update.
Thank you, Chair. Given time, would you like me to take as read and then just summarise in terms of an overview of the paper?
I think probably an overview would be acceptable to people. Yes, that's probably the way to proceed.
Okay. Our intention is, of course, to provide the Transport and Infrastructure Committee with an update on the current state of our ferry network, as well as the future service procurement within the network. Obviously, there's been a considerable change has been undertaken in terms of how we structure and deliver ferry services to Aucklanders over the last few years, including ownership and management of public transport ferry facilities, taken on revenue risk by converting net contracts to gross, added new destinations, we've extended weekends, we've developed downtown, and more recently vessel ownership, including the 4 ex-Fullers boats that we procured during the last negotiated deal. The key thing here is ferry services has been topical. It has rightfully been debated and scrutinised. Like our bus network, services delivered have been heavily impacted by COVID and border closures, which has resulted in substantial and sustained degradation to services delivered. In terms of that, the more complex issue we need to tackle is the long-term sustainable services to be delivered, with substantial cost increases experienced in recent years and fares not being adjusted in line with inflation, and integrated fares, of course, were introduced in 2020. The fare box recovery has been really substantially compromised, and net cost per passengers has increased tremendously. And cost recovery in comparison to fares ranged from 100% recovery to 34% in 2019. Last financial year, it ranged from 7% to 35%. There was an overall average of 19%. The key message in here is it will take time to rectify the service provision. We do have a plan, and we're managing closely and seeing how we can accelerate that plan, connect with other modes, and improve the customer experience with communication. What you have within there is quite a lot of information that goes back to the start of the year when there was a ministerial working group in order to be able to take a good look at that. And you've also got some information in terms of annual gross price and passenger numbers. And we've got, in terms of what we're doing with the accelerated ferry program, including what I would call the compromise in service delivered today, in order to be able to accelerate that regime so we can get back up to what I would call a reliable network. So I will go to questions, Chair.
Okay, so we'll open up to the floor then for any questions. Councillor Walker, yes.
Sure. So I'm looking at the presentation, and you probably understand that myself and Councillor Watson have a particular interest in the Gulf Harbour Ferry. And while you show the Auckland Ferry reliability and punctuality graph, it would be useful to have an overlay for the Gulf Harbour Ferry service on that, because, as you know, it has been decimated. And if I look further at one of your charts, which goes to the timetable reduction and reinstatement, which is in attachment E, I note that almost every other service is having its current contracted services reinstated, with the exception of the Gulf Harbour Ferry service, which is only down to two services, effectively only one at peak time, which is at I think around 7 o'clock in the morning, and one homebound at 5:15. So the question I've got is, why is it that that particular service appears to have been singled out, decimated in point of fact, against a background where many people in the community are heavily reliant on it? So is there a particular reason why that service is so compromised?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. Look, I think it is in terms of when I sort of look back in the history over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, obviously in terms of patronage versus other routes, it has been substantially lighter. And also when they're trying to work out the ferry network and the efficiency of it, they can do 2-3 runs in terms of the inner harbour versus one on the outer harbour. And so because of the way the network works, in terms of that, there has been compromise. I'm not shying away from the fact Gulf Harbour has been substantially negatively impacted by this, particularly over the last year as it's gone down, and it's just disproportionate to Gulf Harbour, absolutely. And I'm happy to take you through that reliability information for that service in particular. And of course, we are trying to bring that back a bit quicker than what is articulated within the pack you have today.
The other question I've got, again, just goes in, according to one of your attachments, attachment E, where you have route costings. And I do note that those costings relate to pre the COVID-19 pandemic. They show some runs as significantly more expensive. Would it not be true to say that one of the main reasons for the expense of a run may well be when that service is being lowered because of poor patronage in the inter-peak? For example, if we look at the Gulf Harbour service traditionally, there's been a great deal of patronage at the peak, but relatively poor service in the inter-peak, yet as much and all as I don't have access to the contract, I assume that the overall contract cost is being divided by the overall number of patrons, and that's being significantly impacted by poor patronage in the interpeak.
Yes, correct. Now what you see here is articulated as 2019 patronage, so at a time when there was good reliability and even, let's say, patronage numbers against today's AGP. So if we were to break that down year by year in terms of patronage and AGP cost, you'll get a different picture in terms of that. It's reasonable to expect that the outer harbour routes are always going to be more costly to deliver. I mean, ferry services in the way that they make up in terms of the financial side of it is obviously there's a really big diesel cost to running ferry services. So that's why we've seen such a substantial escalation. And not putting up fares in line with inflation obviously has a detrimental effect in terms of what that fare box recovery is. You overlay that with in terms of, yes, you might have substantial numbers during the peak and then much lighter. It's a mean in terms of that. That's an average, right? So that is when you look at it across the board.
So would it be possible to get the cost per passenger based around peak rather than an overall figure, because that might give a better appreciation for the purpose of decision making around retaining services? Is it possible to get those figures?
Yes, but I need to understand in terms of what you're trying to say, because there is a contract cost that is for a certain amount of service provisions. Can we cut that down, cost per service? Yes, and you can get what it is for that service only. We can do that if that's what you would like to see. That's totally doable. It's disproportionate though. And
the reason I'm asking that is against a situation where you've got a very poor service delivery and the priority is around peaks, and you have some concern around financial return, that might help to influence the decision making. I've got another question, Mr Chair, but I do understand that there is another item on ferries, that's correct, that you'll be presenting to? Or is everything wrapped up in this one?
This is the only one. We do have an item after this about the RPTP.
Okay,
Yep.
I have some questions around the RPTP and
Okay.
the ferries, but I will ask those questions then.
Yep,
Thank
okay,
you.
so we'll go to councillor Hills now.
Thank you, and just a brief comment, I won't speak, but just want to acknowledge the work that's been done and thank and acknowledge previous Minister Michael Wood for following concerns from Councillor Darby and I, setting up that group to help address some of the major issues that have been plaguing our ferries the last 2 months. 2 years, sorry. I wish it was 2 months. The boats, the EV ferries, are they looking, is there any way to bring any of, it seems to be slowly inching outwards compared to what we expected. What are the timeframes still what they were last released to us?
So the time frame so far as the 2 EVM boats is still within that financial year FY25, so it should be towards the end of the calendar year 24. We're expecting them to be in the water. Good progress is being made with the other 2 Devonport replacement boats as well. So all intents and purposes is that the timelines shared previously is still what is being worked to and should still be getting delivered against Councillor Hills.
Thank you. The Explore group seem to be doing a great job, and I've had really good feedback from them, Bayswater, Birkenhead and Te Aneiwa Northcote. Have there been any moves on increasing those services? Do they have the staff, or is it more a money thing right now?
It's a combination of a couple of factors. Yes, we are talking through with Explore at the moment around when they will be in a position to reinstate the timetable from previous, but also as well as part of those conversations, the main resource constraint is still skippers. So we are having a wider conversation insofar as if there are skippers available within the industry, it is around making sure that we are utilising the best possible place.
And so the intention, just for the public, is to still, once you have the resources, the intention is to bring those, at least those peak frequencies back. So
Correct, yes. As soon as the resource is available, then we will be looking to try and get services returned as best as what we can do.
And same on Devonport, those peak frequencies, the attempt is to get them back?
Correct, yes, most definitely.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Hills. Just a couple of quick questions from me, and the first is really to acknowledge, the points that are made in this report here, and particularly at point 26, that public and customer confidence in ferry services is at an all-time low. So I think it's really important that is acknowledged, because we have to improve that. We have to work. We've only got 9 routes to maintain in Auckland. We have to regain our confidence on all of those routes and get people back to those pre-COVID. That's sort of integral to the whole approach of our public transport rollout. One of the not so negative aspects has been the performance of some of the ferry runs, though, and I just want to bring that up in respect of the tender process alluded to at point 41, and this process to look at some of the non-fullers contracted routes from next year, I think it is. Now, it's those routes, and if I just take a couple as examples, but there will be other ones like West Harbour, like Pine Harbour, that have been the most reliable. They've had the best crew retention, and they're not affected by any of these reductions. Could you just explain to me then what the practical effect is of this new tendering process in respect of some operators who have been leading lights in this period where others haven't shone quite so brightly?
In terms of that, there is what I would call a lot of anticipation of that going to the market, and that's for good reason. Over many, many years, a lot of the ferry contracts have been rolled and rolled and rolled in terms of that, so we do need to go to market. We do need to consider, obviously, future fleet requirements, and we need that sort of longevity with that, because we still have a considerable amount of aged fleet out there, and of course in terms of somebody wanting to get involved with that in the long term, we have to go through the right process to do that.
just as far as that, so that means they're all up for grabs in that tender process then? Anyone can enter that contract round, any operators?
Yes, potentially. Yeah, there has been already a lot of conversations with the sector, and Gareth may want to touch on that in a little bit more detail. But it's important to note that what we did with Bayswater and Birkenhead was an interim measure in order to make sure that we had that continuity for the community. That was done in obviously a very confined time to be able to get that up and running. But it is for a limited time because we do need to go to market. It's been a long time since ferries have been tendered openly.
And just to add what Stacey's just said there as well, insofar as that tendered unit going out to the market, Fuller's have confirmed that they will not be interested in responding to any tender that is issued for those other current non-Fuller's routes.
Yes, and of course that the Fuller's route, the only way any of that can be relinquished is by subcontracting it and at Fuller's with a Fuller's agreement, so they're not open. Okay. The other question I have goes to the risks section of the paper, and specifically the development of stakeholder and public communication plan. So I'm really keen to know what does, given that in a number of instances, certainly some of the ones I'm familiar with, this chronic unreliability goes back to November 2021 and has got worse since then. Specifically, what are we talking about for runs there, for Half Moon Bay, Gulf Harbour? What are we going to do differently that wins people back who have had 2 years of 50% cancellation? So what is different that's going to be happening with stakeholders that gets people coming back to the ferries like they were just a little while ago?
So the key deliverable we need to ensure is service reliability. And what we are advertising is what is being delivered out there. So as part of getting the staffing levels back up to the required numbers that are needed to operate the service, and that is going to be one of those key first deliverables there to get undertaken. The other component as well is that obviously there is a progression of the replacement of the fleet that Councillor Hill's alluded to insofar as the EVM boats, and also as well the agreement to work with Fuller's to replace at least 5 of their existing fleet as well. So skipper availability together with vessel maintenance reliability, both of those combined together will result in an improved level of service that's there. And then once we are in a position to articulate increased confidence in the service, then that will enable us to look at other mechanisms in order to get stakeholders and the customers back on board.
So I guess I was just wondering how you'll be communicating with those customers that have been lost.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Thank you, Chair. So in terms of that, the team has developed, direct communication channels with that. One of the other things that we haven't talked about is obviously there's been considerable comments over the years in terms of what I'll call real-time disruption information. And so in terms of that, there has been a lot of work done, particularly with Fuller's, in terms of notifying customers and getting that out to customers through our app, getting it out on our Facebook page, our social media pages, and on our website with proper time adherence, as well as those alternative services. The disruption piece for ferry has been quite considerable, so the lack of information flowing through to customers has had a big focus. That includes bringing in technology for real-time monitoring a ferry, and what I mean by that is ferry is what I would call the one blind mode on our network. You can't see on a PID how many minutes away it is because they're not tracked like our other modes. So this is part of what I would call multiple things that are happening in that space. So as part of the Accelerated Ferry program, we have committed to providing updates in terms of training hours and what's coming out the other end, where those skippers, where those deckhands, etc. are going. We are getting frequent information on that to be able to give us confidence that we're progressing as planned. But it is one thing, that side of it. The other side is what I call more the customer side in terms of them winning them back as part of, we need that reliability. So we have that across many of our routes. We've seen it improve quite considerably over the last couple of months. We are now going into summer. Historically, summer is obviously a real busy period for ferry. We know when it's a sunny day that we are going to have challenges in terms of boardings, so we're trying to stay ahead of that curve.
Just one final question, if you wouldn't mind. This is a paper to do with, you know, the ferry network. There was a study done last year by the Ministry of Transport into domestic transport costs and charges study by consultants through the Ministry of Transport. And just to give members a little bit of a flavour of what they found looking at operation costs and cost recovery, which we've alluded to here, in the section urban public transport, which included ferries, buses and trains, the fare box and basically the ferry services were nearly all in Auckland, so there's only a couple of single routes elsewhere in the country. The figures they came up with was fare box cost recovery for the three modes was 25% for bus, this is across New Zealand as a whole, 29% for train and 54% for ferry, which was largely in Auckland. The net subsidies then across the modes, nearly 70% for bus, 27% for train, 4% for ferries. Those figures put the ferry kind of split in a better perspective, don't they? In both in terms of fare box recovery and the percentage of net subsidies.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, as I said before we had COVID, if I go back to 2019, some of the ferry routes were actually 100% recovery off fares. And I think that actually the lowest was circa 34% at that time. So we've seen a considerable change due to the cost escalation. That's both in terms of the labour requirements as well as the diesel requirements, and then obviously the gap getting sort of wider as disproportionately looks bad for ferry. In terms of that, obviously the forward plan is to get back up to a reasonable and sustainable fare box recovery for ferry. When you look at it, the public subsidy is always going to be higher in what I'll call a cost per customer basis because the fare is higher. So the idea is obviously to try and get that looking more appealing from a funding perspective. So as patronage goes up, and we can see on some routes as we track it month to month, that is getting substantially better. So the more reliability we get the other services back into the network, that will start to look solid, is basically what I can say to that. It will get back up to that 50% if we work and focus on it.
Yeah, sorry, just one final one that I certainly hear from sometimes ferry commuters and whatnot. If we're going to do the same process for, say, the rail trains, then we'd expect, you know, 5.4 billion for the CRL to go into that. We heard the other day that just the operational costs that come online in 2026, equivalent to a 10% rate increase right across Auckland. So obviously the true cost and subsidies, if we apply them in a basis such as that, is what you'd expect, would look quite significant for rail, for instance, too, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, it is going to go up substantially in terms of that. With ferry, a part of the plan has been always to standardise the fleet size, so actually we can carry more people, etc. So therefore you get more value in terms of each sailing. All that is built on terms of keeping it sustainable for the long term. It's just that obviously over the years we've done a tremendous amount of work on bus, then we've obviously re-procured in terms of our train franchise. It's ferry's turn in terms of making that into the future, so we have the right agreements, the right fleet, the right infrastructure for the longer term.
And so the consequential cost has to go with that, just as it's happened with buses and with trains. Final question, Councillor Walker, which is a quick one.
I'm just raising this question because I thought you might have raised it, Mr. Chair, but I'll raise it myself. So under point 39, there is a chart. My understanding is that some of the information in this chart is incorrect. For example, it uses the expression adjusted gross profit. I understand that the more correct terminology is the adjusted gross price. That is my understanding.
Annual gross price.
Annual gross price. It would be very helpful in respect of this chart and perhaps some information that might accompany it to give some understanding as to who the contributors are. For example, there is a subsidy on the part of Auckland Transport, there's a contribution from Auckland Transport, there's also the involvement in the subsidy from Waka Kotahi, there is the fare box recovery, so there's a cost per passenger. I guess what we're interested in is what is the cost per passenger after all of that, and it's not clear in this chart as to what any of those things are. So I'm not interested in not suggesting a correction at this point in time, but it would be useful because we do have a digital copy of the minutes and the like on the on the council's website to convey some information that gives an easy to understand picture to Aucklanders around the cost structure. Is that possible?
Yeah, there's various different ways we can splice the data that is available to increase, improve understanding. If I can maybe take the opportunity, Councillor Walker, just to explain insofar as annual gross price is the overall cost of delivering the ferry service out there. And then the first deduction from that before we start talking about subsidies is around fare box recovery. So we have the annual gross price, we then deduct off the fare box that has been recouped for that service, and then the balance is then split 51% funding to Waka Kotahi and the 49% through the council that's there. So that's the way that the contracts are formed and structured. Same on bus and the same on train as well. It's the same structure that is there applied.
Got
but
that.
yeah, we can extrapolate out further.
It would be very useful
different metrics.
if you could do that, because obviously we're interested in what it's costing us, and we're also interested in knowing what the Waka Kotahi subsidy is and so on, and that's public information, I understand, certainly through Waka Kotahi.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Gareth has.
Yes.
That, yeah.
And just the other very short question, I note the comment under point 49, Hibiscus Coast community has been disproportionately impacted, The actions noted in this report aim to address this impact where possible. So I'm assuming that means reinstating the services to Gulf Harbour.
Correct, yeah, and that's outlined on the timetable reduction and reinstatement slide that's up on the screens at the moment.
Well, that only reinstates them in a small part. They're actually been removed.
I think that the plan is to reinstate progressively and as quickly as possible, isn't it? And that's the outer time frame.
So there'll be more services beyond the 4 that are listed in 2024.
So on completion of the accelerated training programme by Fullers, we are reinstating services to their pre-reduced levels.
And just a very short supplementary question to that. In a situation where Fullers are able to deliver earlier, which may well be the case, do we have an undertaking that the services will be reinstated earlier?
Dependent on the skill set and qualification of the skippers who have been trained in advance of the existing plan, then we'll be looking to get those skippers allocated to the best benefits as far as the ferry service is concerned. So to answer that another way, Councillor Walker, different skippers need different qualifications to drive different vessels. And if those skippers who are getting qualified ahead of schedule are able to drive the boats onto Gulf Harbour, then they will more than likely be the services to which those skippers will be allocated.
So that's a yes.
Yes, dependent on the completion of the training programme and the skill set that those skippers have got.
Right, final question, Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Stacey and Gareth. Just everything converges on the basin, the downtown basin, and we've got 155 cruise ships this year, or visits. And the Harbour Master, which is part of the Auckland Transport Organisation, but probably a little bit arm's length from your division for good reason, they amended the, I forget what it is, the Harbour Master's direction, I think it is, last year. And it's helped a little bit, but it's pretty clear that we still have considerable conflicts. You know, when a cruise ship comes in and maybe it misses its window by 20 minutes, it still comes in. And then you can quickly have 7 or 8 ferries hanging out off Princess Wharf. Cut to the chase. From your point of view, Stacey and Gareth, do you think, are you staying abreast of that issue of contests for space down there with view to going back to the Harbour Master and working with the Port of Auckland to say to the cruise industry, you are welcome, but you're welcome on our terms, and you need to be here by 6, and you can leave after 8 p.m, something like that. Is it coming to that? Because I cannot see a resolution there at the moment.
Look, our teams collectively continue working with the cruise industry and with Ports of Auckland, you know, the Harbour Master and the AT side. We have a day of operations team that do the real-time monitoring, and of course we have people on ground at downtown. It is a problem. As soon as they come out of alignment in terms of what their patterns are, that does have a negative impact in terms of the basin. So there is constant communication. So we're monitoring obviously through this summer. This is the first summer that we've had what I'd call a proper cruise season since 2019. So we'll be able to have some robust conversations using the data from that going into the next round. So there's a plan to do that.
Councillor Darby, so that brings to end the questions. So thank you, Gareth and Stacey. Put the recommendations up on the board.
Can we just have a clarification on the strikeout of the...
Yes, okay, yeah,
authors?
happy to do that, Councillor Darby. So this was decided at the run-through. We looked at the recommendations that were put up. So in respect of the first one, B, the wording as originally stood was endorsing an endorsement. So that was a little clumsy to say the least, and something that had already happened. So that's why we changed the wording on that. As far as C, as far as C goes, where we were getting asked to endorse a holistic approach of the procurement strategy. Well, in the first instance, as we've found out in the paper, it's not holistic. A holistic, by definition, is related or connected to a complete system or a whole, whereas this strategy, as outlined, has two different approaches to the tendering. And if we look further into the ferry procurement status update, we'll see in the attachments there that the strategy is under review as it stands, and there's a whole list of reasons there that why it's under review, and that the eventually emerging preferred packaging option from the review will be presented to the ferry PCG in the coming months. So that procurement strategy isn't and updated for approval, so it's not exactly clear what we'd be approving at this stage. So that's the reason for those striking out.
Can we just get then, because the authors have written that recommendation, the two before us, can we just get some comment on that then, that the strikeout, the recommendation from the chair is to strike that out? Correct. You wrote that recommendation.
Yes.
Can you please comment on that? So it is correct that we're probably, at best, we're probably noting the review of the Auckland Transport Procurement Strategy.
Absolutely, because it already has been formally agreed via our board. And so today was really about providing that update to make sure we're sharing that information, and so everybody has a reasonable understanding about what's happening in that space, particularly given the amount of questions we've had in recent months about ferry. Thank you.
Okay, so you'd be comfortable with just striking it out, or a C that would be a noting?
Excuse me. Really up to the officers to decide what.
I can ask a question of the authors of the report any time.
We'd actually finished with the presentation.
No, you cannot dictate. You've allowed a speaker to run for 10 minutes today, and you're not allowing me to ask a question of
You've asked your question. I've made an explanation as to my recommendations. I'm moving them. They're seconded by Councillor Fletcher. You're quite at liberty to attempt an amendment if you want, or to question that, but I've given an explanation as to why I've moved, and it's been seconded.
Yeah, and look, I think what I'm hearing from the authors of the report who were not given the opportunity until I invited the opportunity, Chair, and I think it's upon you to actually ask the authors comment on your recommendation when you strike them out.
Councillor Darby,
But
I'm not interested.
I will accept the strikeout.
I'm talking, so
No,
I'm the chair.
I will
so if you-
accept the strikeout.
I don't want to call you to order, Councillor Darby, but I did try to explain to you that this was discussed in some depth, as you will be aware as a former chair, in the run-through, and that was a consensus of opinion, not just with me, but with the deputy chair and the officers who were present. And I'm assuming that was communicated to the relevant authors. So if you don't mind, if you'd like to debate it, by all means do, but I'm opening it up to debate now.
Yeah, we'll say a word. I think in your report, you pretty much understate.
Excuse me, sorry, Councillor Darby. We're in debate, and I said if you wouldn't mind retreating to the safety of the barricades, while the debate rage on. Over to you, Councillor Darby.
Thanks. Look, I actually do want to say that the mode of ferries was the really broken mode. It was the broken mode 10 years ago, and probably since Councillor Hills has been a councillor with me, we actually just haven't picked it up of recent. We've actually been working with staff for a long time to repair the status of that mode of ferries. And I've been pretty delighted. There's been some real challenges with Auckland Transport, but I've been pretty delighted about the support I've got to rebuild ferries. And of course, as North Shore councillors, we're the ones that are most affected. We've got the most ferry services coming from Devonport. Now that's off exempt, and that was a success for us, through to Birkenhead, across to Northcote, Bayswater, back to Bayswater, and then up towards Beach Haven. We've got a number of services there, and we lost the Stanley Bay service. We fought hard for the Stanley Bay service, but I think the one thing that sort of spoke to me why it had to go was when I found out what the subsidy rate was, and at that time it was something like about $22 a passenger, from memory. But now we're steering at some of these services at subsidy rates of 40 plus. It's enormous. But I think there's been a lot of success of recent in the last couple of months in the ferry space. By no means perfect, got a long way to go. But I do endorse the ferry strategy and getting to actually own the fleet, control the fleet, and then contract operators as we do for the other modes of bus, but particularly like train. But there's been a big increase in patronage on ferry of recent. Not all routes, and I know some are constrained by staffing issues and vessel availability, but there's been some considerable success. The queue at Devonport in the morning, on some services, it's running from the boat all along the boardwalk, all the way back to the bus stop, and that's probably a couple of 100 metres. And I'd like to see that go to 20 minutes tomorrow, but it'll be going to 20-minute service from the current half-hour service. I think it's now June next year. But I think I do want to acknowledge Auckland Transport for listening to us over the years. We haven't just come to you as Johnny-come-lately councillors complaining. We've actually worked with Auckland Transport over a very long period, and we're going to have to work constructively together over a very long period going forward to bring this mode up to the status of the new rail and the new bus network. Thank you.
Councillor Walker.
Sure. I'd like to commend the Auckland Transport officers on the report. It's really good that we've got this, and I am encouraged that various services, particularly the Gulf Harbour service, will be reinstated. I am personally very confident that we'll be able to reinstate that service quicker than what has been proposed here. So on that basis, Mr. Chair, it would be good to have an ongoing update, particularly around ferry services at your meetings. It doesn't have to be long-winded, but it would be really good to track how we're winning back our patrons, and that would be one way of communicating with them. Encouraged that that there will be some reinstatement, because my observation and the observation of people in the community that I live in is that the roads are becoming more congested, and the attractiveness of the ferry service, given that there can be one, is climbing. So it will meet a very strong need. The only other observation I make, Mr. Chair, very quickly, is that I do know that there have been a number of approaches for other services, particularly a bike ferry across the harbour by multiple operators, and that would be a way, again, of taking cars off the road and offering another option. And that goes to my comments earlier in the day around congestion pricing and the like. There are mechanisms that we should be applying now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor
And
Ward.
thank you to the officers.
Councillor Fletcher.
Mr. Chair, it's the end of a long day, and I think it's proper that we do acknowledge all of the officers of the Council and of Auckland Transport and others who have enabled us to have a sensible discussion around this. But I also want to acknowledge you. I know how many hours you put into detailed analysis of these agendas, the work that goes in beforehand, the pre-meetings, the post-meetings, and I find it frustrating at times if there is anything that could be perceived as vexatious to the chair. Ultimately, you are very fair in your chairing of this committee. You give everyone the opportunity to speak, and I, for one, am happy with the outcomes today. And I also want to acknowledge our lead officer, Barry Potter. I think it's, unless you've actually been part of this particular transport committee, you don't realise the very close and collaborative way, and Mara, who's quietly sitting in the background just making sure everything happens properly, how much work goes into this. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher, and I'll just very quickly exercise my right of reply. I didn't speak at the start, and I'll be quick to expedite things. And it just really goes to, I think, the importance of taking a historical perspective when it comes to some of our public transport services, and I think none more so than with the ferry. So as much as there is a plan for the future with the electrification of the fleet, hopefully the recovery of the services, I think we should remember that it was only a couple of years ago that some of these decimated services were incredibly successful. And so we're going back to 2019, where services now that are down to 4 sailings a day had 24 sailings. They had patronage numbers of 18,000 a month, and they were growing. So a little bit like some of the graphs we see of public transport in Auckland in the 1940s and 1950s, we had a successful model. It was working. It wasn't broken. Admittedly, we had the intervention of COVID and what followed from that, but we fundamentally had a service that was successful, that was well patronised, and that was appreciated by the community. And I think of all the public transport modes, which has been become very clear to me in my ward, which has 3 separate ferry services, I think more than any other single ward, or equal to North Shore anyway, Hobsonville, West Harbour and Gulf Harbour, is that the ferry service is almost a reflection of the identity, in some instances has been the basis, like Pine Harbour also, for the development of that community. So the community has actually been predicated on having a ferry service because of their locations, and the ferry service remains the fastest, the most convenient and the most popular by a country mile of commuting. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that. If we go back a little further again, we'll see back in the 1920s and 30s that Auckland, City of Sails, had a vibrant ferry service that went to all parts of the region, some of which have fallen off the radar. So I guess my hope is, in just concluding, is that we resurrect what we have, which has been the consequence of significant investment over the years, and we used to grow, what after all is a limiting offering, only 9 separate services. It's to be hoped that we can keep that going in a city of 1.7 million, not just for the commuters, but also for the rest of Auckland in the weekends and holidays, where people have the opportunity to catch the ferry like our predecessors did to all the different parts. So that'll certainly be the focus of this committee for the balance of the term, and I thank all the members who are contributing to that. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We're coming up to 4:45, folks, and just I think a couple of items to go. So